My name is Miller Files. For most people, February 1974 was just another cold stretch of winter across the Midwest. Snow drifted over open farmland in Wisconsin. The wind carved across Interstate 90 like something alive. Cars passed in long, lonely intervals. It was the kind of highway where time felt suspended. But for a 25-year-old art student named Mary Kay Schlais, that winter day became the final page of her life. Mary left Minneapolis with hope in her bag and ambition in her eyes. She was on her way to Chicago to attend an art show. Friends described her as independent, thoughtful, creative. She believed in people. In the early 70s, hitchhiking was not seen as reckless. It was common. It was almost romantic in a restless American way. She stood near Interstate 90 with her thumb extended. Drivers saw a young woman bundled against the cold, carrying a portfolio and a small bag. At some point, someone stopped. That someone would never publicly answer questions. Mary was last seen entering a dark pickup truck. That is where the known timeline fractures. The next day, February the 15th, her body was discovered in a rural area of Dunn County, Wisconsin. Snow muted the landscape. Silence pressed in from every direction. She had been stabbed multiple times. The crime scene told us several things without speaking. The attack was personal. It was controlled. The killer brought the weapon with him. There was no sign of prolonged struggle across a wide area, which meant the assault likely happened quickly. The location was not random. It was just far enough from the highway to avoid immediate detection, yet close enough for a driver who knew the terrain. In 1974, we did not have the tools we rely on today. There were no surveillance cameras mapping every mile, no cell phone records tracing movement, no national DNA databases capable of cross-referencing distant relatives. There were fingerprints, interviews, and instinct. Investigators canvassed truck stops. They questioned local men. They followed tips that dissolved into rumor. More than 100 potential suspects were examined in the early years. None could be tied conclusively to Mary. The file grew thick. The answers remained thin. When I first opened the archived case decades later, the smell of aging paper hit me before the details did. Photographs faded at the edges. Handwritten notes from detectives who had long since retired or passed away. Their frustration lived in the margins. The hardest part about cold cases is not the lack of effort. It is the erosion of time. Witnesses forget. Memories shift. People move away or die. Evidence degrades. But sometimes evidence waits. Mary was not targeted because she was Mary. That is the cruel truth. She was vulnerable in a specific moment. A young woman alone on a winter highway, trusting that the person who stopped would be decent. The killer likely did not know her name until after he had already decided her fate. This was not a robbery gone wrong. There was no clear financial motive. The violence suggested dominance, control, a predatory impulse. We often imagine monsters as visibly different from us. In reality, they drive pickup trucks. They hold jobs. They blend into communities. They pass through our lives unnoticed. As the 70s turned into the 80s and then the 90s, the case slipped further into silence. Detectives retired. Leads dried up. Mary's family carried their grief without answers. I have seen many families in that position, suspended between loss and uncertainty. Without a name attached to the crime, grief cannot fully settle. In those early days of my review, I studied the map repeatedly. Interstate 90, cutting across Wisconsin, the rural roads branching off into isolated patches of farmland. I asked myself one question over and over. Who knew that stretch of land well enough to use it as a hunting ground? The killer had to be comfortable there. Comfortable enough to leave the highway. Comfortable enough to commit violence. Comfortable enough to return to his normal life afterward. Predators are creatures of habit. They operate inside zones they understand. At that point, we did not yet have the technology to identify him, but we had something just as powerful. Time. Time can be an enemy in investigations, but it can also be patient, waiting for science to catch up. Mary's case was not forgotten. It was waiting, and so was the man who killed her. This is only the beginning. When a murder goes unsolved, it does not disappear. It lingers. It lingers in the minds of detectives who replay the evidence late at night. It lingers in the quiet moments of a victim's family. It lingers in small towns where people remember a winter that felt colder than it should have. After the death of Mary Kay, Schlais investigators in Wisconsin moved quickly. In the first weeks, urgency filled every conversation. Patrol officers worked extended shifts. Detectives drove hundreds of miles across counties chasing fragments of information. In 1974, law enforcement relied heavily on interviews. You knocked on doors. You looked people in the eye. You trusted your instincts when something felt off. Truck stops along Interstate 90 became critical points of focus. Drivers were questioned. Logs were reviewed when available. Mechanics were asked if they remembered a pickup truck with unusual damage or suspicious behavior. Waitresses were interviewed because they saw everyone who passed through. One witness recalled seeing Mary enter a dark-colored pickup truck. That detail became the center of the investigation. Dark-colored. Pickup truck. Male driver. It was not much to build on. Composite sketches were discussed but never solidified into something reliable. Memories blur quickly, especially when people are asked to recall ordinary moments that later become extraordinary. More than 100 men were questioned during the early phase of the case. Some were local. Some were travelers passing through. A few had prior records for assault. None could be conclusively tied to the crime scene. The forensic capabilities of the time limited what could be done. Biological evidence was collected, carefully preserved as best as possible under the standards of the era. But DNA analysis, as we understand it today, did not yet exist. Investigators examined tire impressions near the rural site in Dunn County. Snow had partially preserved patterns, but weather conditions degraded them quickly. Photographs were taken. Plaster casts were attempted. The results were inconclusive. The murder weapon was never recovered. When you do not have a weapon, you rely more heavily on motive and opportunity. But motive in this case was elusive. There was no strong indication of robbery. There was no personal connection discovered between Mary and any suspect. It appeared to be a crime of opportunity. Opportunity is one of the most dangerous factors in criminal behavior. It requires no long-term planning. It requires only presence and impulse. By late 1975, the initial wave of leads began to slow. Tips still arrived, but they repeated theme already explored. A suspicious neighbor, a drifter, a trucker who once made an unsettling comment. Every lead had to be investigated. Every name had to be checked. Years passed. The case moved from active investigation to periodic review. Detectives who originally worked it transferred, retired, or moved into administrative roles. New investigators inherited the file, but not the emotional memory of those first days. That emotional memory matters. It drives urgency. When I first sat down with the full archive decades later, I noticed something subtle. The early reports were detailed and intense. Handwritten margins contained underlined words and exclamation points. By the early 80s, the language became procedural, routine. The file had grown quiet. Mary's family never stopped asking questions. They reached out to authorities at intervals. They attended memorials. They lived their lives with an absence that never closed. Unsolved murders create a particular kind of pain. It is not only grief, it is suspension. In the late 80s and early 90s, forensic science began to evolve. DNA profiling emerged in criminal investigations. At first, it was used cautiously. Laboratories were limited, backlogs were extensive. The evidence preserved from Mary's case was reviewed again. Could it yield something new? Testing methods were attempted as technology improved. Some samples were too degraded. Others produced partial profiles that could not be matched to any known offender in existing databases. The National DNA database system, known as CODIS, eventually became a powerful tool. Profiles from convicted offenders could be compared against crime scene evidence. In Mary's case, no direct hit appeared. That absence can be misleading. It does not mean the killer was innocent of other crimes. It may simply mean he was never caught for them. Meanwhile, the cultural landscape of America shifted. Hitchhiking declined sharply as public awareness of violent crime increased. Stories of highway predators entered national headlines in other states. Serial offenders were identified in various regions. Each time a new name surfaced in the news, investigators quietly asked whether that individual could be connected to Mary's death. Comparisons were made. Timelines were checked. Geographic patterns were analyzed. Nothing aligned strongly enough. In reviewing the behavioral elements, I focused on location. The rural area in Dunn County was not randomly selected farmland. It was accessible yet isolated. A driver unfamiliar with the region might not have known where to turn off without drawing attention. The killer likely had familiarity with western Wisconsin. Possibly he lived there. Possibly he worked routes that passed through regularly. Comfort with terrain often indicates personal history. Comfort also indicates confidence. Confidence suggests prior experience. That does not necessarily mean prior murder. It could mean prior acts of aggression that escalated over time. During the 90s, several persons of interest were re-examined as forensic tools improved. Some provided voluntary DNA samples. Others were eliminated through alibi confirmation. One by one, names were crossed out. Cold cases rarely close because of dramatic confessions. They close because of persistence. Because someone keeps turning the file over, asking the same questions in slightly different ways. By the early 2000s, Mary's case had entered what many would consider permanent cold status. The file remained accessible but inactive. I do not believe in permanent cold cases. Evidence does not age the way people do. It waits. Science advances. Techniques evolve. In the early 21st century, a new investigative method began to reshape old cases. Genetic genealogy. Instead of matching DNA directly to a suspect in a criminal database, investigators could compare unknown profiles to public genealogy data, identifying distant relatives and building family trees backward toward a possible source. It required patience. It required legal navigation. It required precise lab work. When I first considered that approach for Mary's case, I knew it would not be quick. But I also knew it represented something we never had before in 1974. A way to follow bloodlines instead of rumors. The man who killed Mary had lived freely for decades. Perhaps he married. Perhaps he had children. Perhaps he attended community events and paid taxes and mowed his lawn on Saturdays. He may have believed that winter day had vanished into snow. He was wrong. Episode 2 of this story is about silence. Years of it, But silence is not the same as absence. Sometimes silence is simply the pause before truth speaks. By the time we reopened the possibility of solving Mary's case through genetic genealogy, nearly 5 decades had passed since her death. 5 decades is long enough for a killer to believe he has outrun history. It is not long enough to outrun biology. When I say biology, I mean something simple and relentless. Blood carries memory. Cells carry identity. DNA does not care how much time has passed. It waits quietly inside evidence bags, sealed in storage rooms, patient in a way human beings never are. The preserved evidence from the murder of Mary Kay Schlais had been tested before. Earlier attempts using traditional database comparison yielded nothing conclusive. There was no direct match in CODIS. No known offender whose profile aligned perfectly with the unknown male DNA recovered from the scene. For many departments, that would have been the end of the road. For me, it was the beginning of a different road. Genetic genealogy does not ask whether the suspect himself is in a criminal database. It asks whether someone related to him has voluntarily shared DNA for ancestry research. It is a method that builds outward and backward at the same time. The first step required careful legal review. Policies had evolved. Privacy concerns had to be respected. Every move had to stand on solid constitutional ground. We worked with forensic laboratories experienced in extracting the most viable profile possible from aging samples. When the refined DNA profile was finally ready for genealogical comparison, it felt like holding a key that might or might not fit a lock. The initial search returned distant relatives. Third cousins, fourth cousins, names that meant nothing at first glance. But genealogists do not look at individuals in isolation. They look at patterns of lineage. They build family trees from the ground up, tracing marriages, births, deaths, migrations across states. Hours turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The genealogical analysts constructed multiple family lines branching across the Midwest. Many descendants lived ordinary lives. Teachers, factory workers, farmers, veterans. The task was to narrow the field. We focused on men who would have been between 20 and 35 years old in 1974. We examined geographic ties to western Wisconsin and eastern Minnesota. We reviewed employment histories when possible. Did they drive for work? Did they travel Interstate 90 regularly? Did they have any documented history of violence? One name began to stand out. Jon Miller. He had lived in Minnesota during the early 70s. He had geographic proximity consistent with the crime scene. He was the right age at the time of Mary's murder. There was one complication. He had died in 2015. When a suspect is deceased, the dynamics of an investigation change. There will be no interrogation, no courtroom testimony, no cross-examination, only confirmation. We needed a direct DNA comparison to ensure that our genealogical path had not led us astray. That meant locating a biological relative close enough to provide a meaningful sample. Investigators discreetly identified family members. Procedures were followed carefully. Consent was obtained where required. Samples were collected and sent for laboratory analysis. Waiting for those results felt heavier than any moment in the earlier stages of the case. We were no longer dealing with vague possibilities. We were on the edge of naming the man who had taken Mary's life. When the laboratory report came back, it did not scream. It did not dramatize. It simply confirmed. The DNA from the crime scene was consistent with a biological relationship to Jon Miller's immediate family line. Statistical probabilities reached levels that removed reasonable doubt in forensic terms. Nearly 50 years after a young woman stepped into a pickup truck, we had a name. I sat alone with the file for a long time after reading the report. Not because I was surprised, but because of what it represented. The man had lived a full life after 1974. Records showed employment history, residential addresses, community presence. Nothing in his public life suggested he would become the focus of a homicide investigation decades later. That is often the most unsettling reality. Violence can coexist with normalcy. There was no indication that Jon Miller had ever been arrested for murder. There were no widely known accusations that connected him publicly to Mary's case. If he carried guilt, he carried it privately. I studied his timeline carefully. Where he worked, where he lived, who he associated with, whether any unsolved cases along Interstate 90 during that era bore resemblance. Patterns matter. The attack on Mary suggested control and decisiveness. It did not show chaotic frenzy. It suggested someone capable of functioning immediately afterward without drawing attention. Someone who could return home. The question that lingered was whether Mary had been his only victim. Genetic genealogy solved the identity question, but it did not automatically solve the narrative. It did not tell us what he said in the truck. It did not tell us whether he planned the attack or seized an impulsive moment. It did not tell us whether he replayed it in his mind for decades. It told us one thing with clarity. He was there. When law enforcement publicly announced the identification of Jon Miller as the responsible party, reactions were complex. Relief, sorrow, frustration that justice in a courtroom would never occur. For Mary's surviving relatives, the announcement closed one wound and opened another. Closure is rarely a clean line. It is layered. As I reflect on that breakthrough, I think about the evolution of investigative science. In 1974, detectives relied on shoe leather and interviews. In the 21st century, we follow strands of DNA across generations. Both methods require persistence. Episode 3 of this story is about bloodlines. Not only the blood spilled in a snowy field in Wisconsin, but the blood that connected a killer to a family tree decades later. Time did not protect him. Science reached back and tapped him on the shoulder. And for the first time, the silence around Mary's death had a name attached to it. But identification is not the same as understanding. In the next chapter, we will confront the psychological landscape of a man who lived almost half a century beyond the crime and the questions that remain unanswered. When we finally placed a name beside the murder of Mary Kay Schlais, the investigation shifted from who to why. The name was Jon Miller. He was no longer a shadow in a pickup truck. He was a documented human being with an address, history, employment records, acquaintances, and a life that continued for decades after February 1974. That is the part most people struggle to understand. How does a man commit a violent act on a winter highway and then return home as if nothing happened? I have studied violent offenders for much of my career. The public imagination often divides people into clear categories: monster and neighbor, predator and family man, evil and ordinary. Reality is more complicated. The available records showed that Jon Miller lived in Minnesota during the early 70s. He worked. He maintained a residence. Over the years, he built a life that did not outwardly signal the capacity for lethal violence. There were no widely publicized arrests linking him to homicide, no sensational headlines attached to his name during his lifetime. If he displayed aggression, it was either unreported, unnoticed, or absorbed quietly into private spaces. When I examine a case like this, I begin with behavioral consistency. The murder of Mary suggested control. The attack was decisive. The location was selected with enough familiarity to avoid immediate discovery. The killer did not leave a chaotic trail across multiple counties. He left a body in a place that would delay detection, then vanished. That is not the behavior of someone overwhelmed by spontaneous rage alone. It reflects calculation within a short window of time. Calculation implies composure. Composure allows someone to drive away, clean themselves, and resume routine. We cannot know precisely what occurred inside that pickup truck on Interstate 90. We do not know whether there was conversation first, whether trust was established, whether the attack happened suddenly or after a shift in tone. But we do know that after Mary stepped into that vehicle, she lost control of her environment. Control is central in crimes like this. Predatory offenders often seek situations where power can be asserted without interference. A lone hitchhiker on a winter highway represents vulnerability. A remote rural road represents privacy. A concealed knife represents readiness. What we do not know is whether Mary was the first. When a suspect is identified decades after a crime, we revisit other unsolved cases from the same era. We analyze geographic overlap. We examine similarities in method. Interstate 90 runs through multiple states. Thousands of vehicles traveled that corridor daily in the 70s. If Jon Miller used that route frequently, opportunity would not have been limited to a single encounter. However, opportunity alone does not confirm repetition. Some offenders commit one act of violence and never escalate. Others repeat behavior until they are stopped. Without confession or direct linkage to additional cases, we cannot declare certainty. Still, the question remains. I reviewed timelines of unsolved assaults and homicides along that stretch of highway during the mid-1970s. I looked for patterns involving young women traveling alone. I searched for similarities in weapon choice and disposal location. Nothing produced a definitive connection. That absence does not guarantee isolation. It simply reflects the limits of available evidence. As I studied Jon Miller's later life, I wondered about internal narrative. Did he revisit that winter day in his mind? Did he justify it to himself? Did he compartmentalize it so thoroughly that it became a sealed memory? Compartmentalization is a powerful psychological mechanism. It allows individuals to separate actions from identity. To say internally that what happened in one moment does not define the rest of their existence, but for victims and families, that moment defines everything. Mary's life ended at 25. His continued for more than 4 decades after her death. He experienced birthdays, holidays, ordinary mornings. She did not. That imbalance is difficult to reconcile. When law enforcement announced his identification publicly, there were no images of handcuffs, no courtroom sketches, only archival photographs and factual statements. Justice, in this case, could not be performed in the traditional sense. There would be no trial transcript to read aloud, no sentencing hearing. Instead, there was acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that Mary did not vanish into abstraction. Acknowledgement that the man responsible was real and named. I have been asked whether solving a case after the suspect's death feels incomplete. The answer is complex. On one hand, the legal system cannot render judgment. On the other, truth carries its own weight. Families deserve to know who took their loved one. Communities deserve clarity. Silence breeds speculation. Speculation distorts memory. By identifying Jon Miller, we restored factual ground to a story that had floated in uncertainty for decades. Still, I often return to one image in my mind. A pickup truck slowing on a frozen shoulder. A young woman weighing trust against cold wind. A decision made in seconds. Every homicide contains a crossing point. A moment where 2 lives intersect and one continues while the other ends. Jon Miller went home that night. Mary did not. As investigators, we cannot change the past. We cannot reconstruct the exact words spoken in that vehicle. We cannot ask him why. But we can remove anonymity. We can document behavior. We can speak her name. Episode 4 is not about spectacle. It is about confrontation with uncomfortable truth. A man lived among others, carrying a secret that science would one day uncover. He may have believed that winter snow erased his tracks. Snow melts. DNA remains. In the final chapter, we will consider what justice means when it arrives decades late, and what Mary's story leaves behind for the rest of us. There is a misconception about justice. Many people believe justice arrives in a courtroom. They imagine a judge seated high above polished wood. They imagine a jury listening carefully. They imagine a sentence pronounced in a steady voice. In the case of Mary Kay Schlais, justice arrived in a laboratory report. It arrived almost 50 years after she stepped onto Interstate 90. When law enforcement publicly identified Jon Miller as the man responsible for her death, there was no dramatic arrest. No trial. No closing arguments, only facts carefully laid out before the press and the family. For some, that felt incomplete. For others, it was everything. I have sat with families who lived decades without answers. The uncertainty becomes its own form of punishment. They replay possibilities in their minds. They imagine scenarios that grow darker over time. The absence of a name leaves space for endless speculation. When a name is finally attached, speculation ends. Truth may hurt, but it anchors. Mary's relatives carried her memory through generations. Photographs, stories, holidays where her absence was still acknowledged. Younger family members who never met her still knew her name. That is something a killer can never erase. After the announcement, I spent time reviewing the entire case file from beginning to end. I wanted to see the arc clearly, from the winter of 1974 to the modern era of genetic genealogy. The transformation in investigative capability is staggering. In the 70s, detectives relied on physical canvassing and intuition. Today, we can trace identity through distant relatives who never knew they were part of a criminal investigation. Science does not replace determination, it enhances it. The detectives who worked Mary's case in the early days did everything available to them. They walked snowy fields. They interviewed truck drivers. They followed rumors that led nowhere. They preserved evidence with care even when they could not yet unlock its secrets. That preservation is why we were able to solve the case decades later. Evidence is silent but loyal. It does not complain when forgotten on a shelf. It does not resent the passage of time. It waits for the right question and the right technology. In reflecting on Jon Miller's life after 1974, I sometimes consider the psychological burden he may have carried. Or perhaps he convinced himself that the event was detached from the rest of his existence. Human beings have an extraordinary capacity for denial. But denial does not alter fact. He was present. He committed violence. He left a young woman in the snow. Mary never saw another spring. The announcement of resolution did not bring her back. It did not restore lost decades to her family, but it did restore narrative integrity. Her story no longer ends with a question mark. It ends with a period. There is another dimension to cases like this. They change behavior across generations. In the early 70s, hitchhiking was common. Trust in strangers was higher. Over time, stories of violence reshaped public caution. Highways that once symbolized freedom came to symbolize risk. Mary's death was part of that cultural shift, even if her name was not widely known at the time. As a detective, I often think about the intersection of chance and choice. Mary made a choice to accept a ride. Jon Miller made a choice to turn violence into action. One decision was rooted in trust, the other in harm. Justice cannot undo those choices, but it can clarify responsibility. Closing this case did not feel triumphant. It felt steady, grounded, necessary. I visited the stretch of Interstate 90 where she was last seen. Winter again, snow across open land, trucks passing in long intervals. Highways carry thousands of stories. Most are ordinary, some are not. Standing there, I thought about time, how it stretches forward without regard for what it leaves behind, how it layers new lives over old tragedies. Mary's name now exists in official record, not as an unsolved mystery, but as a resolved homicide. That distinction matters. It honors the truth of what happened. If there is a lesson in this case, it is not fear. It is persistence. Investigations do not end simply because they become difficult. They do not expire when suspects age. They do not dissolve when headlines fade. Somewhere in a box of preserved evidence, answers wait. Episode 5 is not about revenge. It is about recognition. Recognition that a life was taken. Recognition that a man was responsible. Recognition that science and patience can intersect even after decades. I am often asked why I continue to revisit cold cases. Because silence should not be permanent, because families deserve clarity, because winter does not last forever. The snow that covered Dunn County in February 1974 melted long ago, but the truth remained beneath it. My name is Miller Files, and this file is closed.